distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to the Danube Institute. I hope you like the splendid new building which we're now occupying. I have the honor to be the president of the Danube Institute. My name is John O'Sullivan, and on behalf of my colleagues at the Institute, it's my pleasure and duty to welcome you to this conference. Our topic is the return and the transformation of geopolitics 30 years after the end of the Cold War. Both the return of geopolitics as a theory in a theory-rich field of international relations and its return to international relations themselves, accompanied by history. No one here needs to be told, of course, that the return of geopolitics is a very topical topic. We pride ourselves at the Institute on our timing, holding conferences just at the point when the world is realizing the importance of whatever it is we're discussing. On this occasion, we all hope that we have not been as prescient as in the past, and that our conference will not prove to be quite as topical as the world fears, and particularly as the peoples of Central Europe feel. A distinguished British historian, the late Hugh Thomas, once remarked that there were two kinds of historians, those with a theory of history and those with the knowledge of history. In the last 30 years since the Velvet Revolutions of 1989 and 1991, it's beginning to look as if the latter historians with the knowledge of history have the better of the argument. Theories of histories have been enjoying quite a short shelf life, arriving and departing in periods of a decade or so. When the Cold War ended in 1989-91, the duopoly that had exercised power in the world was replaced by what Francis Fukuyama called the end of history, by which he meant not the end of history in the sense of one damn thing after another, that's never going to end, but the end of history as a competition for the best and most acceptable method of ruling and being ruled. It ended with the victory of liberal democracy, a world in which all political regimes would be either liberal democracies or gradually moving towards that destination. After that, Professor Fukuyama thought, and he's amended some of this early theory, he thought that politics would become a matter of technical disputes, like trade treaties determined by political institutions like the European Union, all very boring and safe. As we know, however, the period of US and Western dominance, what others called America's unipolar movement of world leadership, turned out not to be boring at all. It had considerable achievements to its credit, notably the lifting of several billion Asians out of abject poverty into a middle-class lifestyle. And also, particularly important, the transformation of Central and Eastern Europe from economic wastelands under socialism into market democracies that were gradually attaining prosperity. Yet, in 2008, that unipolar moment of American dominance came to a sudden end. Signs and portents of that strange and semi-suicidal end can be seen in retrospect. The rise of Vladimir Putin on a program of nostalgia for the Soviet Union, the growing gap between the United States and old Europe, especially visible in the diplomatic run-up to the Iraq War, the persistent discomfort of France under all governments with an Atlanticism in which France could never hope to be the dominant influence, the cultural evolution of German politics towards a national identity rooted in pacifism, economic strength, anti-Americanism, and commercial pacifism. The growing dependency of all European countries on Russian energy, the resistance of ordinary Europeans to surrenders of national sovereignty to Brussels, and finally, Washington's feckless over-reliance on monetary expansion and Chinese purchases of US bonds to fund its out-of-control spending. All these developments, so I suggest, culminated in two events of 2008, the Russian invasion of Georgia, the Russo-Georgian War, and the financial crash of 2008. I think those two events marked the end of the triumphant phase, at least, of the post-Cold War period. But though the post-Cold War moment of Western dominance had started to perish, it hadn't been replaced by another, and it hasn't been replaced by another stable order. Indeed, the period between 2008 and today has been one marked by turbulence and uncertainty, tensions within alliances, the escape of nation states from international bodies, as in Brexit, wars and their results in huge migration flows, apparently insoluble international problems, owing in one case to the euro, and much else. But we are moving, it seems at the moment, towards some sort of resolution one way or another. We now see two states, Russia and China, challenging what remains of the Western liberal order. Mr. Putin's recent diplomatic demands amount to reversing the outcome of the Cold War and overturning the present structure of European security. President Xi makes no secret of the fact that he intends to supplant the United States as the hegemon of a new international order. That obviously then these challenges have produced an inevitable reaction from states alarmed by such claims. This weekend's Munich Security Conference was dominated by the question of how NATO should respond to Russia's challenge on Ukraine. On the other side of the world, the recent AUKUS agreement between the US, the UK, and Australia may be the start of a similar alliance system in Asia that seeks to contain China and perhaps to recruit Japan and India to itself in time. Today's conference is an attempt to understand these and other new patterns in international politics, to make predictions of where they're leading, and to propose some practical approaches to preserving international peace without sacrifice of Western interests or democratic principles. My institute colleagues have recruited a distinguished and diverse conference of all the talents, political, academic, diplomatic, and military, to guide us through the controversies of several continents. It simply isn't possible for me to mention everybody here by name, but I would like to thank in particular the Right Honourable Tony Abbott, former Prime Minister of Australia, who has travelled further than most to be present here and to give the keynote address. The other speakers are numerous and all distinguished. I will just simply say, for example, that we have a particularly distinguished delegation from the United States. I believe we have every think tank in Washington represented in our discussions today. Hungary itself has provided an entire chancellery of diplomats with wide experience abroad to discuss the situations. And we have other distinguished guest experts from India, from England, from Canada, from Poland, and from Wales. So I want to say finally how delighted we are to host several speakers from the Hungarian Ministry of Defense to discuss the role of the Hungarian armed forces in NATO and Central Europe on the occasion of the 100th anniversary of Hungarian-American military cooperation. We devote one session of our conference to this important and, of course, highly topical subject. We are very grateful for the Ministry's help. It is now my pleasure to conclude this brief introduction. I was to introduce Dr. Gaspar Maroth from the Ministry of Defense, but unfortunately he has succumbed to COVID, and we miss him, but other distinguished speakers from the ministry will later will be speaking on this topic at a particular session. It's now my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker and an old friend, Tony Abbott, former Prime Minister. I should say the Right Honourable Tony Abbott, former Australian Prime Minister, a man who I think fought 3 elections and won 2 out of 3, and wasn't given the opportunity to fight the 4th. But he has been a significant force in bringing what I'd call common sense conservatism into Australian politics. He has, in particular, played an important part in sustaining the commitment of Australia, not only to I was going to say the Atlantic Alliance, one easily falls into that era, but to the institutions of Western cooperation in defense and foreign policy, and who is remaining and who remains an important voice on that matter, particularly now that the AUKUS agreement has been reached, which will surely be the development, which will surely develop into a more a large alliance covering other countries and a wider range of activities. He is therefore the perfect person to speak to us this morning. I welcome him and invite him to take the floor.
Thank you, John. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It is an honour to be here in this wonderful city, at this marvellous venue, and in such company. Some years ago, at an East Asia summit in Burma, I found myself standing with Japan's Shinzo Abe, plus China's Li Keqiang, and the Sultan of Brunei. China's Premier was upbraiding the Prime Minister over Japan's record in war. So to create a distraction, I grabbed the Sultan and loudly told him that he must be very angry about British colonialism. So having thus seized the antagonist's attention, I observed to Li Keqiang that history was a good teacher, but a bad master. So with that in mind, I've adjusted the topic of this talk from the revenge of history to the lessons of history, because history isn't malicious, simply instructive. It tells us that progress isn't inevitable, that justice isn't always done, that good won't always win, and that danger always lurks. Above all, it tells us that individual and collective choice matters, that our beliefs drive our actions, and that havoc can be wreaked or stopped because people decide to make a stand. Few things have been more telling than the reaction of key countries to the Russian army poised on Ukraine's borders. Britain and America have sent anti-tank and anti-aircraft missiles, but no troops. Germany has been reluctant even to threaten sanctions should Russia invade. And in shades of Munich, France has championed a peace deal based on changing the Ukrainian constitution to meet Russia's demands. In trying to extract a pledge from his smaller neighbour that it will never join NATO, the Russian president is exploiting the universal fear of war in an attempt to dictate the policy of NATO and to smash the independence of Ukraine. He's relying on everyone's unwillingness to take risks for someone else, and so far he's succeeding. The Americans and the Europeans are divided, and the West looks largely impotent. The only ones to emerge with much credit are the Ukrainians themselves, who've stood to their defences and insisted on their right to conduct an independent foreign policy, including joining NATO and the EU. But regardless of how this particular episode plays out, let's be under no illusion. Vladimir Putin sees himself as the new Tsar, a ruler for life, determined to restore Greater Russia. To that end, he's invaded Georgia, annexed the Crimea, occupied the Donbass, killed without compunction opponents at home and abroad, and restored Russia as a military superpower despite an economy smaller than Italy's. Ukraine is but his present target because it persists in looking west, not east, and because the 1994 Anglo-American Security Assurance, named for this very city in return for the surrender of Soviet-era nuclear weapons, failed to replicate the one-in-all-in provision of Article 5 of the NATO Charter. However the current standoff ends, we can be confident that Putin's campaign will continue, remorseless, relentless, by all means, up to and including all-out war until Ukraine becomes a Russian colony. And then his attention will turn to the Baltic states and then to Poland, and then to the other former Soviet satellites, until Russia is again the overlord of Eastern Europe. I fear the only thing that will stop him is death, defeat, or the conviction that he would lose. Now, on what do I base that? Well, after a Russian missile battery shot down MH17 over the eastern Ukraine, killing 38 Australians, I promised to shirt front the Russian president. Now, that's an Australian sporting term for a very rough tackle. So I had that robust conversation with him on the sidelines of the APEC summit in Beijing in 2014. With rare intensity, he insisted back then that Ukraine was really Russian, that their government was fascist or worse, and that provocateurs had brought down the plane. And then he grabbed me with both hands and said something both strange and revealing. "You are not a native Australian," he said, "but I am a native Russian." And it's this passion for blood and soil and sacred mission that drives my sense that he's ready to take big risks to restore the Russia of his dreams, especially against weakness and vulnerability. Now, of course, Putin is not Hitler, and Ukraine is not Czechoslovakia, and these are not the 1930s. But there are plenty of disturbing parallels, including a new axis of great powers ready to disturb the peace to get what they want. A fortnight back, the Russian dictator and his Chinese counterpart, Xi Jinping, issued a declaration on international relations entering a new era, they called it. We know the type of new era they have in mind from their preposterous claim that both Russia and China enjoy what they called long-standing traditions of democracy. Now, this would be news to the jailed Russian opposition leader, Alexei Navalny, and to the jailed Australian news anchor, Cheng Lei, and to the tennis star, Peng Shuai, now doomed to life in a cage. For Beijing, democracy with Chinese characteristics obviously covers the internment of more than 1 million Uyghurs, the strangulation of Hong Kong despite the solemn promise of one country, two systems, and the near daily intimidation of Taiwan, a genuine democracy that proves there's no totalitarian gene in the Chinese DNA. Not for nothing has China built what's already the world's largest navy, plus a militarised coast guard, plus a maritime militia, and achieved what many defence planners think is military superiority over the United States in the Western Pacific. The main purpose of this joint declaration, this Moscow-Beijing axis, is to bury, they say, the political and military alliances of the Cold War era. So no more NATO, no US troops in Japan and South Korea, and ultimately an end to the Pax Americana through a dictator's partnership that has, they say, no limits and no forbidden areas of cooperation. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, maybe it's not, but it's definitely a free hand from each for the other to do its worst. At heart, what they both reject is the American-backed world order, a liberal and humane set of understandings and arrangements that's enabled the very best time in human history, with the world's people more safe, more free, and more prosperous than ever before, even though they've both benefited from it, with 500 million Chinese moving from the third world to the middle class in scarcely a generation after President Clinton bent the rules to admit China to the WTO, and with Russia becoming a petropower that can turn Europe's energy on and off like a tap. For years, American officialdom ignored the Chinese leadership's much-stated intention to be the world's top country by mid-century, only for the Secretary of State just a week ago in Melbourne belatedly to declare that China's goal was indeed global domination. So, with these latter-day dictators clearly on the march, as Lenin once asked, what is to be done? In his celebrated speech attacking the Munich sellout as a defeat without a war, Winston Churchill declared that this was but the first foretaste of a bitter cup, which will be proffered to us year by year, unless by a supreme recovery of moral health, and let's underline that, moral health, he said, and martial vigour, we arise again and take our stand for freedom as in the olden time. A response to the dictators starts with appreciating that just because war is unthinkable to us doesn't make it unthinkable to them. Since the beginning of time, the strong have always been tempted to take advantage of the weak, and the tough and the hungry have always sought to usurp the indolent and the soft. Throw in what Hume recognised, that passions drive reason, and what's unthinkable to most can become entirely reasonable to some, especially those on a quest for national glory. Last week, the German Chancellor proclaimed that war has become unthinkable in Europe, and we have to make sure it stays that way. Even though he must know that up against someone who thinks differently and who routinely uses war to achieve his ends, the only way to avoid war is to surrender. Now, is Germany so ashamed of its past and so enervated by its wealth that it can no longer stand up to those set on taking advantage of it, including a Russian president bent on economic and military blackmail? We must hope that events don't give us the wrong answer. That's the baleful side of 1989. This notion that the fall of the Berlin Wall marked the end of history and the era of universal peace based on the triumph of liberal capitalism. Rather than a new beginning, 1989 was simply one brief shining moment in time when liberal nations were clearly ascendant over illiberal ones. But that was soon squandered through misplaced idealism, by bloody, expensive and largely futile nation building in Iraq and Afghanistan that sapped the West's strength and self-confidence, and by welcoming China and Russia into global markets that's increased their wealth and strength, but not their goodwill. As their current adventurism shows, both countries' exceptionalism still includes the conviction that they should dominate their regions, if not the wider world. All that's lingered from those heady days 3 decades back is the conviction of Western elites that their obsessions with climate change and identity politics are widely shared, coupled with their strange unwillingness to call out in other cultures what they condemn in their own. As the 5 decades after 1945 show, the only way to keep aggressors at bay is collective security. Otherwise, the strong do what they will and the weak suffer what they must. Take Eastern Europe. If it's Russia against Ukraine, sooner or later Russia will prevail, as Russia ultimately did against the heroic Finns in 1940. Take East Asia. If it's China against Taiwan, China will inevitably prevail. But if it's Russia or China versus the democracies, all for one and one for all, that's an entirely different matter. Perhaps this military crisis might awaken the people of Western countries, so recently discombobulated by a virus and so unaccustomed to sacrifice, to how readily a freedom that's not cherished and defended can be lost. This is starting to dawn on us in Australia, A wave of illegal migration by boat was successfully stopped. Chinese telcos seeking to build vital national infrastructure were banned. When China weaponised trade against us with $20 billion lost in boycotts, we did not flinch. And by the shrewd practice of democratic multilateralism, Australia has helped to revive the Quad, created the AUKUS alliance with the US and the UK for more nuclear submarines in the Indo-Pacific, and deepened our military partnership with Japan. Australians are accustomed to answer the call all over the world because we've always known that deterring aggression means letting the aggressor know that their targets aren't alone. And as history shows, the best way to make potential aggressors think again is to have a contingent of Allied soldiers in place so that an attack on a relatively weaker country means engaging the forces of relatively stronger ones. There's no point unnecessarily provoking Moscow by accepting Ukraine into NATO right now. But why shouldn't the British and American trainers have stayed in place to help, if needs be, their Ukrainian comrades in arms? There's no point provoking Beijing by declaring that the one China policy can accommodate one Taiwan too. But why shouldn't more Allied soldiers slip into Taiwan to join the US Special Forces that have reportedly been there for some time? At the very least, NATO should be ready substantially to reinforce its frontline states and to supply the Ukrainians with whatever they need to fight. The point of this would not be to threaten Russia or China with offensive weapons, just to remind bullies of the natural solidarity that should exist between countries striving to be free. We have to make the war that's unthinkable to us for moral reasons unthinkable to them for prudential reasons. We who shrink from war because it's morally wrong have to make others shrink from war because they'd likely lose. Of course, our instinctive initial reaction is to avoid entirely quarrels in faraway countries between people of whom we know nothing. Yet what other countries' freedom might be dispensable if theirs is? And who would we fight alongside if not them? And if others' fights aren't ours, who might help us when our turn comes? This is where moral health is indeed called for, as much as martial vigour in any contest between nations. We can't forget Churchill's other observation that jaw is better than war, provided we remember that the point of diplomacy with dictators is to deliver a stern message that their demands are unacceptable. It would be shameful were any pressure to be put on Ukraine to accept Putin's demands because concessions would just embolden a bully. Even now, I'm not sure how widely it's grasped. What's at stake in this confrontation between democracy and autocracy, between sovereignty and subservience, and how the whole trajectory of history could change? If Russia seizes Ukraine, a new Iron Curtain will ring down in Europe. If China exploits the confusion to seize Taiwan, the whole world order would shift against the democracies as Indo-Pacific countries made the best deal they could with the red superpower or armed themselves to the teeth against it. It would be a poorer, harder world. So at the least, in these more ominous times, countries need to end their energy dependence on Russia, as well as their dependence on China in critical supply chains, and to renew collective self-defence to the point where no aggressor could think war worthwhile. Meanwhile, comrades Putin and Xi watched the scuttle from Kabul because a long-term military presence was judged to be too hard, the toppling of statues because yesterday's heroes have to be damned by today's standards, and our self-flagellation over race and identity, even though there's never been less racism, and minorities have never had a fairer go, and conclude that a decadent West is unlikely to defend itself with vigour, let alone stand up for others. They see America in retreat, and no other country or collection of countries with strength and goodwill sufficient to be the guardian of peace with freedom. For all of us as individuals and for each of our countries, the challenge is to prove them wrong. And as long as there are millions who would seek a better life in Western countries, we need to accept that vote of confidence in ourselves and never weaken on what's made us great.